I think we can jump straight into the workshop. So the way we have done it is for each session, we have put up 2 questions to you. So the presentation hopefully will address or give their take on those 2 questions that we put up. The presentation should last no more than 5-7 minutes. And as I said already, I will try to be strict, but not to be punishing, but just to give space to others to discuss and to question. Again, as Gunther mentioned, we are not going to try to make a list of unmet needs. Although I do want to make a little bit of an introduction on what are unmet needs. I think the perspective we need to have is one of switching from the medicine to the disease and the burden of disease. So we have been thinking products because the regulation, of course, tells or obliges industry to present a pediatric investigation plan when developing a product that they intend to present for marketing authorization. And that has made a lot of progress indeed, and I'm not going to repeat that, but what we really would like to encourage is to think disease, to think burden of disease. And this is one of the reasons why we wanted and we have involved the World Health Organization has to have this global perspective on needs from the disease viewpoint. What are the population in needs? Where are these population? And then from that derive how to address that. So this is of course a complex endeavor because it really needs an effort from all parties, all stakeholders to think differently in terms of pediatric development. And we want to underline that because we realize we cannot take a whip and oblige anybody or developers to do that. However, by understanding and focusing on what the unmet needs are, we want to shift the perspective, the way of thinking, the approach of developers supported by academia, by healthcare professionals. We want to hear these voices because we want to make the point that developing medicine for children is not an obligation derived from a legislation, but is an obligation derived from the fact that we share this imperative of meeting the needs, the unmet needs of children with serious diseases. So with this shift in perspective, we hope that all stakeholders can help us to make even more a success of this legislation than it has been until now. So with that, I will introduce every speaker by their name. The affiliation is already in the program that you have received, so we will know who the speakers are. Forgive me already in advance if I don't pronounce all the names correctly. This, although we are in a European environment, some of the languages still are a challenge, particularly Dutch. We have to get used to that, but we'll do our best. Otherwise, I think we all understood the gist of it. And so with no further ado, the first few speakers, 4 of them, represent academia and healthcare professionals. So I start with Luca Sangiorgi, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind invitation and for giving us the opportunity to present. In this case, I will present the vision of an ERN, of a bond ERN, that is the ERN for rare bone disorders. The method that we have used in order to collect all the information is a scoping exercise. And here you can see already an example on what we have done. We have created a white paper on diagnosis and the problem of diagnosis that we have presented to the European Parliament. And we had also the honor to have Commissioner Andriukaitis, it was presented during the Rare Disease Day, to be present at our meeting. Why doing that? Because we, inside our ERN, we have a working group on clinical trial that is now working on collecting the real needs of the patient, but not only of the patient. We are working also on this kind of scoping exercise among the patient, the investigator, and the industry. Another point that is critical for us in this kind of definition is what are the core data that we need to clearly define and that we need to clearly collect. And as you have seen, we are keep on going, and we will have some result hopefully by May of this year. And then another point that we think is essential in order to collect all this kind of information. So again, it's an ongoing process. This is the methodology that we are using, is to involve all the different stakeholders. And that's why we have set among our ERN a stakeholder forum that will collect all the information from the different stakeholders. Please consider that ERNs have a legislation that will include only healthcare provider and EPACs that are representative of patient organization. But we know that the situation is much more complex and that we need to involve also companies, private companies. We need to involve also charities that are willing to support us in this kind of exercise. And we also need to involve a policymaker and regulators that are key players in this role. Another active work that we are currently doing is a validation of the quality of life tool that has been that is actually been working in UK, and we are expanding this to all the countries that are part of our ERN. It's 10 countries and 38 healthcare providers all over Europe. But we are also doing this in collaboration with some centers in the North and South America and Australia. And this questionnaire on the quality of life is also capturing what the patient wants us to work on. A clear example of this is a recent publication done by some member of our ERN that have been working on the short status of patients affected by many different diseases like achondroplasia or pseudo-hypothyroidism, like you can see here. So in very short term, what we are running right now are scoping exercise in order to collect the real patient needs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Luca. You stuck to the time beautifully, and thank you for that. We move on to the next presenter, Tjitske van den Zanden. Thank you very much.
I think the example that was given there, we wondered if psychiatrics and obstetricians would make sense on that sentences. So right now here I'm proposing, or we are proposing, so instead it should be
okay, well, thank you for the opportunity.
The management of patients treated with retina. And in this case,
Someone on the phone. Someone listening.
Okay, well, now I have the floor. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work we've been doing with the Dutch Paediatric Formulary in the past 10 years. And first of all, I would like to set the scene. We started the Dutch Paediatric Formulary in 2008, and we had the scope to provide dosing guidelines for off-label pediatric use as well as on-label use. What you see on the screen is just a screenshot of the Dutch Paediatric Formulary, which is a web-based formulary and open accessible to anyone. The dosing recommendations are listed within the formulary and are also referenced in the formulary. We had the scope to be highly transparent about the backgrounds of our dosing recommendations. And this is what you see on the front end, on the website of the formulary. But behind the scenes, we have quite extensive documents that list all scientific evidence that is available for our off-label dosing recommendations. And these dosing recommendations are created by a review of available scientific literature that is summarized in a drug monograph, and that is also extensively summarized in a risk analysis document. And the most important thing about our drug monographs, it's not only the available scientific evidence that is listed, because as we all know in pediatrics that is quite limited most of the time, but it's also complemented by a thorough review of the editorial board, which is a multidisciplinary expert network consisting of different pediatric specialists of all kinds. General practitioners, clinical pharmacologists, pharmacists, and they have the task to complement the evidence base with the practice base, and that's very important, which I will show in the next slide. Because in the past 10 years, we have reviewed the literature for 300 most frequently used drugs in children, and those were most of the time off-labelly used drugs, or drugs that were not completely licensed for all age groups in where the drugs are actually used. And these are most of the time all drugs rather than the recently licensed drugs. What we did is provided dosing recommendations for all clinically relevant age groups and indications. And this is where the review of the editorial board is of so much importance, because the practice-based evidence, so the consensus and the expert opinions that really establishes the pediatric needs, complements the limited scientific evidence. And we always stated that we don't want to reject the use of a drug because there is such limited evidence, because we know in daily practice there is this need to use the drug. So we choose to provide information, how limited it may be, on how to use the drug safely. So the Dutch Pediatric Formulary can be considered as a formulary that represents the clinical medical needs in pediatrics. So if you combine this medical need with the low level of evidence that there might be for our dosing recommendations, that's where you come to the pediatric research needs. And within our Dutch Pediatric Formulary, we have documented what is known about a drug for off-label use. And this can be extrapolated from our database, but it takes time and effort. But it might be a good idea and helpful to identify unmet pediatric needs. So we would like to suggest to pilot with the regulator and the Dutch Pediatric Formulary to develop a method so we can extrapolate and extract all these data from the documentation we already have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we move on to our third speaker from the academia healthcare professional perspective, Martina Pitzer, please.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Altieri. Dear colleagues, thank you for the possibility to speak here, and I have to apologize that my English is not as good, but I will try. You see my declaration of interests, and I want to add that I'm from my clinical training a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and thus I would focus a bit on the unmet needs in the area of mental and behavioral disorders. I would not dwell on the problems, but briefly outline some problems in this field. As you probably know, it's a high burden of disease for children and adolescents with mental and behavioral disorders. And we have a frequent, not only off-label, but off-patent use of old drugs because there's a scarcity of innovations. And in addition, comorbidity is rather the rule than the exception in the field of mental and behavioral disorders. Thus, we often have to use more than one medication in children, and this rather complicates the problem. And as you probably know, the brain is the most complex organ of the human body, and brain maturation extends well throughout childhood, adolescence into adulthood. Adolescence is known as a period of heightened neuroplasticity, and we know that there are developmental changes in the receptor density, in the expression of receptors, in the neurotransmitter content, and this is all not so well understood. The most data are from animal models, and thus extrapolation from adults, even if we overcome the differences in pharmacokinetics, we can't expect that the pharmacodynamic properties are the same for children, adolescents as in adults. Thus, safety and efficacy cannot be readily extrapolated. Now, how can we have also many mental and behavioral disorders, and there are other pediatric conditions. To the second questions, how to prioritize. Dr. Alteri has already mentioned the burden of disease, and one criteria to suggest to prioritize would be the burden of disease as based on the disability-adjusted life years as one criterion. And the second would be the existence or even the non-existence or shortage of other non-pharmacological treatment options, which would be in the field of mental and behavioral disorders, for example, psychotherapeutic measures. In other pediatric fields, it could be surgical treatment options or functional treatment options. And to collect these data, if there are non-pharmacological treatment options, you could, for example, look what is stated in evidence-based treatment guidelines or other sources of evidence-based medicine as a second criterion. And last, I would just shortly go to some other methodological considerations which have been already mentioned. I would start with a third point, maybe a public-funded program with focus in pediatric pharmacology to young scientist physicians would improve their knowledge, and thus they could, based on their clinical expertise and with their pharmacological training, identify further gaps of knowledge in old medicines and also develop their own clinical research independent from industry and independent from the thinking coming from adults to children. The other 2 points I think have already been mentioned. The data compiling and registry formularies, I think this is a very interesting approach Mrs. van der Zanden has mentioned, and the widespread public education, because it's even in mental and behavioral disorders very difficult to get patients in clinical trials. Parents are very reluctant over this. Understandable, of course, and though I would like to say that widespread public education could be helpful to overcome these difficulties. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martina. And then we conclude the perspective of academia care professional perspective with Dr. Gilles Vassal. Please, Gilles.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. To the question, which initiative are we implementing to identify the needs of the pediatric patients in the field of oncology, I would like to share with you the Pediatric Strategy Forum that we are jointly implementing with the European Medicine Agency and Accelerate, which is a multi-stakeholder platform that we created in 2015. We believe that the needs and the strategy to develop new drugs should be defined at the same time. And this is what the Pediatric Strategy Forum is about. It's about of sharing information and advanced learning in a pre-competitive setting to inform pediatric drug development strategies and subsequent decision by the European agencies and the pharmaceutical companies. The goal is to define the needs and such to facilitate prioritization. The principle is a dialogue and a constructive interaction between all relevant stakeholders. In these forums, we have clinicians, academics, researchers, patient representatives, pharmaceutical companies, and regulators. The content is first define the biology of the disease, second, agree on the therapeutic needs, including epidemiology, clinical features, standard therapy, current needs, and future therapeutic plans. And we approach that in a joint initiative between Europe and North America. And in addition, companies present the non-clinical and clinical data of the compound they are developing and may be of interest for this disease. How it is done? 6 months preparation, including telephone conferences with speakers and pharmaceutical companies in advance. It's a 2 days meeting at the European Medicine Agency, by the way, in this room. And it's on invitation only, following expression of interest, following advert on the websites of EMA and Accelerate to the pharma, academia, and parents. The output is a summary on the website, and in addition, an article published in a peer-reviewed journal. We already did 2 forums. The first one was in January 2017 on ALK inhibition in pediatric malignancies. The second one in November 2017 on mature B-cell malignancies. And let me just briefly summarize this one to make you understand what it is. There were 73 participants from European and North American experts in the field, parents, patients representatives from the Unite to Cure in Europe and Children's Cause for Cancer Advocacy in the US. There were regulators from the European National Competent Authorities, from the European Medicine Agency, the Pediatric Committee, and the Food and Drug Administration. There were 15 pharmaceutical companies who presented 20 medicinal compounds discussed. The conclusion briefly, first we identify that this disease is rare. The current treatments are highly effective with more than 95% event-free survival, especially through the introduction of rituximab through a pediatric investigation plan, but no salvage therapy. That the acute toxicity is significant, but most survivors do not have long-term toxicity. So the needs are A, develop innovative treatments for patients remaining incurable and dying of this disease despite the good results, and B, reduce the high acute toxicity of the current therapy. The main conclusion were first, most malignancies in children differ from those in adults. We cannot simply extrapolate. Second, any successful de-escalation needs to be done at low risk in frontline therapy only when we do have an effective salvage therapy. This is what the priority is, to develop salvage therapy, considering the very small number of patients that we need a global strategy, considering combination rather than monotherapy, and of course correlating biology to all what we are doing to better understand the rationale and the risk and the priority and the biomarker. In addition, the clinicians define what are the priorities among all the 20 compounds being developed. And the academia said we need to focus priority on antibody conjugates, on CAR T cells, and on T-cell engagers. Where do we go? The next one will be in September on checkpoint inhibitors used in combination, and we start working on the fourth one, which will be on acute myeloid leukemias. We believe that this is not be restricted to pediatric oncology, but can be useful for other disease areas. And this is planned to be implemented in a project of a European clinical pediatric network, which is in final, when I can say that, Mark, in the final, very soon, starting at May 1st, and there will be a task really to propose these tools, forums, in other diseases than pediatric oncology. To the question how to identify the diseases, we think that it should be based on the data from the European Commission report and the European Medicine Agency report. It should focus on the disease where there are many drugs and where PIPs do not deliver at the moment. And in addition, to look at the very specific disease where no medicine are being developed. And we think that the process should be completely different from the one that was implemented in 2007-2009 to establish the so-called priority list in the pediatric medicine regulation. Just to say that it's a very good collaboration with everyone. I would like to thank Franca Ligas, Giovanni Leza, Koen Noga from the European Medicine Agency, Isabel Perez as well, and of course Andy Pearson, who is in the room, and the SIOP office and the Accelerate office, Elena Botonina and Samira Isaf. Many people in the room attending the last meeting, last forum, and I think they will be able to further discuss the point. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilles. We are doing very well with time, so more time for questions later on. And we pass on to the industry perspective. Marie-Yvonne Douste-Blazy, who is sitting here next to me on the right. Please, Marie-Yvonne.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to share the industry perspective on pediatric medical needs, and in particular on the following points: ongoing initiative to identify pediatric medical needs, and methodology would be suggested not to prioritize, but to identify these unmet needs. Ongoing initiative at industry level, pediatric medical needs are considered in the scope of the PIPs. At companies level, it's based on opinions from key opinion leaders, experts, academic societies, patients, caregivers, and networks, with a view on medical needs. Opinion which is based on clinical experience of disease registers and national quality hospital registers, which contributes to the knowledge of the disease and informs decision on scope of PIP. Across companies, I would like to highlight the interest of disease-specific strategic forum, the example of the Accelerate EMA forum on mature B-cell malignancies, just Gilles spoke about, and also the Pulmonary Artery Hypertension Forum on June 2017. With the input of multi-stakeholder contribution, regulators, EMA, FDA, academics, patient representative, and industry, in the objective to address medical needs to specify specific population, such as risk population, neonates, oncology. Additionally, I would like to say also that IMI projects, such as the ITTC P4, is very important to define the disease and to provide a clear guidance for use. Regarding the methodology, a disease classification, there should be an agreement on the disease classifications that are used to organize the pediatric conditions according to specific categories defined in classification system. Which data should be attached to each pediatric medical need? In addition to the data required under Article 44, prevalence of a condition in pediatric population, seriousness of the condition to be treated, and the availability and suitability of alternative treatments for the condition in the pediatric population, there should also be an indication of type of needs, need for treatment, need for better treatment. For example, improve safety and or improves efficacy. In addition, existing supporting data, including ongoing clinical trials, basic research to increase scientific knowledge, for example, etiology of the disease, and other research, e.g., to refine targets. The list of pediatric medical needs should be agreed by all stakeholders. For industry, it is key to direct pediatric development for the products in their pipeline to the most appropriate area. There is a need for regular updates of the list of pediatric medical needs with a multi-stakeholders contribution, frequency to be determined, additional information of status of research, and a global alignment. There is a need to discuss also how the list of pediatric medical needs is leveraged in decision-making commitments versus waivers and/or deferrals. To conclude, we believe that defining pediatric medical needs has benefits well beyond PIPs in pediatric research. We support a multi-stakeholders review to clarify pediatric medical needs. We agree that specialist groups should be tasked, for example, as done for pediatric oncology and for pulmonary artery hypertension. Indeed, pediatric networks have a key role to play. And we believe that the regular review of the needs is a way of ensuring that research continues to be directed towards areas of unmet need to enable better research in children's disease.
Thank you very much. So we heard the industry perspective, and I'm sure we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss that and the other presentation. Now we move on to patient perspective, patient representative, and we start with Goeres. And again, the affiliation you have in your program. And please, Anne, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for having invited us. Actually, on my name tag, it's written Fondation Krebskrankheitskanner, which is a childhood cancer organization in Luxembourg, but that's not why I'm here today, because I represent many other organizations and parents through Europe for childhood cancer, and we got united in 2015 under the brand name Unite to Cure. We tried to answer both of your questions, and in the initiatives to identify pediatric medical needs, we thought that our structure is an initiative that should be highlighted. We are a European network of parents and patient representatives, and we really wanted to work on the PMR to understand why the needs are still unmet. So our first focus is determine those needs, based on our own experience as parents or as caregivers, to raise public awareness and advocate on national and EU levels about unmet needs through campaigning. We wrote an open letter to the Health Commissioner. We answered to public consultations. We regularly ask for meetings with the Commission, with the European Council, with the different health ministers in the different European countries. And the last point is that we're really looking for an open and transparent dialogue with all the stakeholders through Accelerate platform, the Paediatric Strategy Forums Gilles Vassal was talking about, the EMA workshop, like today, probably also in future the ERNs. And the goal is really to have the better treatments for children and young people with cancer and a swifter access to innovation. Why? I wanted to highlight it because we still need to improve the cure rate. We still have high-risk cases. The cure rate below 50%, even some at 0% of cure rate, it's not bearable today. We have to improve the survivor's quality of life. We know that 2/3 of childhood cancer survivors have severe long-term side effecting, and 50% of them impacting their daily life. We still have 6,000 deaths in Europe from childhood cancer. It's still the first cause by disease above children of the age of 1 year. The cure rate stalled for the last 15 years, and between 2011 and 2015, we have 70 new anti-cancer drugs in adults and only 2 for children. So the actual PMR and orphan drug regulation are not working for childhood cancer, and that's why we call for a change. And in thinking about the criteria and methodology to prioritize diseases on condition of unmet needs, of course we continue our public awareness and lobby work. We continue participating in pediatric strategy forums. we definitely want to break the 18 years dogma. It is of no medical use that children above 12 years and under 18 years are not allowed to participate in a certain number of clinical trials where it's proven that it could be benefit for them. We think it's very important to speed up the molecular understanding of the pediatric cancers. That would help in the methodology. There's a question mark. Could FDA and EMA have a bigger alignment on regulation with the example of the Race for Children Act based on the mechanism of action and a list of unmet needs? There's also the improved implementation of the pediatric medicines regulation. We need this earlier submission of the PIPs, like it is stated in the Recital 10, Article 16. Why is it not done? How could it be improved? I think it will be one of the topics this afternoon. And last but not least, evaluate the impact of the class waiver list review, which should be applicable in mid-2018. Children should really not have to wait to access these life-saving drugs. And to hear that this day should be concrete and should have a definite outcome is not only what we wish, but is what deserve our children. So we really hope that we have an action plan at the end of the day.
Thank you very much, Anne. And then I leave the floor to the next patient perspective representative, Skåra, who is from the PHA Europe.
Yes. Thank you. Sorry, I was seated the wrong place. So I'm replacing Patrick Hassel, who has a child with PH, and he has given me his input. So when it comes to ongoing initiatives, we are aware that there was an initiative that started actually here in June 2017. And one of the things that they focused on was the endpoints that are not really geared towards children. When it comes to the pH, the endpoint is an invasive endpoint, so-called right heart catheterization. And it has been now agreed that you can accept a non-invasive endpoint, like 6-minute walk test, actigraphy, which is a device like an Apple Watch that you wear to check the activity of the child, biomarkers, MRI, echocardiography, and so on. Another thing that was focused on was the patient-reported outcomes, which is, as you know, the patient themselves that report, and this is not really geared towards children either. And now they are working on new PROs, which we think should be implemented. And also when it comes to the clinical aspects, we believe that patients and carers should be involved early in the design of the studies. Registries, we have problems there. For instance, we register what kind of medication that the patients use, but not the dosage. And dosage is very important when it comes to children because they use off-label adult medication, but with different dosage. So when you do research, it would be very interesting to know the dosage that was being used. And also it was identified that there was a lack of pediatric cardiology networks, which is now being addressed. So when it comes to criteria and methodology, I guess one criteria to use would be the disease seriousness. The picture up there to the right is the first PH patients that I met in Norway. His name is Nicholas, and he was 1 year old, and unfortunately he was not able to celebrate his 2-year birthday. So PH is a very serious disease, and with a fast progression, unfortunately, for children. But for adults, many manage to live a long time with this disease. And we believe that with proper use of medication, children could also live much longer. So for instance, I myself, I'm a patient. Life expectancy of a patient is about 5 years after diagnosis. But I've lived 13 years, and I'm living proof that one can live a long time with good quality of life with proper medication. And I believe this should also be the case with children. So the methodology would be to work together with key stakeholders and to improve these registries. That would be very useful. And also to include, also to work on the pediatric networks. So if you look at the picture down below there, that's Meline. She was also diagnosed when she was about 1-2 years old, and she managed to live a long life, and she's now a student. She's about 22 years old. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hal. And we move on to the last patient representative from Eurordis, Virginie Hivert. Please, Virginie.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. So I'm representing the rare disease patient in Europe. I've taken the two questions in the opposite order, trying to come up first with some consideration regarding how to define the unmet pediatric needs and how to reflect on the criteria for prioritization, and then I will share with you how we do collect feedback and which initiative we have ongoing. So maybe to start with, the first consideration I have is that we are talking about unmet medical needs, but quite often, actually, especially with the rare disease, the need may be unmet only because of lack of access to a product. So I wanted to make that point when starting my speech. Then when coming back to how to define unmet medical needs, I do totally agree, and I'm on the same line than what Erika was saying at the beginning, that in fact it's maybe much on how to assess the burden of the condition, how to define what is important for the patient, and then what is the expected outcome, what is the expectation with regard to the treatment. So I think here we have to put some effort into trying to define this weight of what the product will bring to the condition, and that's why it's so important to develop more studies on patient-reported outcome, as it has already been mentioned previously. Then, because we are considering the pediatric population, I think one important point is that this unmet need might be dynamic components. It might be dynamic because of the progression of the disease, but I do think there are a component of the age-related expectation and needs, which has been shown by some studies already. Then I think we also need to consider this approach of the needs more broadly, also by trying to look at the unmet parents' needs, because that's a component that is very important, how the parents are coping with the disease of their child. And even the quality of life of the parents might be considered as a surrogate endpoint in the clinical study, I do believe. Then, with regard to criteria that we might be taken into account when trying to prioritize the development, it has been shown already for a long time that rarity of the condition is bringing an added higher unmet medical needs. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Also, we know that the rare disease field is also bringing some very innovative developments, so that's the positive angle, I will say. Then in terms of the patients that are really in situation of unmet needs, of course, there are many rare diseases, for example, where there is no treatment at all. So this has to be taken into account. We also should have in mind, obviously, the consideration related to the product in itself and its potential to address the needs. So I'm not saying that we should give priority exclusively to curative treatment or to disease modifier or whatever. I'm just saying that we need to look into those components and to match them with the needs expressed by the patient. So basically my message is that we should put more effort into trying to define the needs and into trying to find commonalities which might help us to define which are the higher medical needs, and as the commissioner was saying, which patients are experiencing the most urgent needs. Then my second point is how we do to get feedback from the rare disease community, because as you may know, Eurordis is an umbrella of patient organization, more than 800 patient organizations, so we do have some feedback from our members of their unmet needs. So we do received feedback in various ways. Some are more structured than others, but all are very variable. So we do receive feedback from individuals, from patient organization. We do have national alliance by country. We do have European Federation by medical area, and we are also linking with the ERNs that were mentioned in the first presentation through our European Patient Advocacy Group. And I really think that there is a huge opportunity within the ERN networks to gather more information on which are exactly the needs from the patient community. So I really welcome the type of initiative that was described in the first presentation. Then we also do have a program that we have launched a few years ago, which is a survey program which is called Rare Barometer Voices. We do have more than 7,000 respondents in this program, and it allows us to prepare survey and to ask so our respondents from the rare disease community their opinion on various topics. In this program, 40% of the participants are parents of children living with rare disease. So I just put at the bottom of the slides an example of a recent survey that we did on the participation in research. And just to show you that we can then analyze the result and present them when targeting specifically the result related to the pediatric population. And this to say that this year on our work plan for the Rare Barometer Voices, we are planning to try to explore better how the pediatric population is doing with the treatment coverage. So we have started working internally on potential question, which is proven to be quite difficult to really shape some question that might help us to get really some useful feedback. Because, for example, you cannot really ask to people whether they are taking their treatment off label or not. That's not something that will speak to people. So I just put here an example of the question we have tried to develop, and I hope also with the discussion of today that we will be able to refine our question and to get more insight from your side. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So without any need of cracking whips, we are well ahead of schedule, which is good news because we will have more time to discuss and perhaps even 5 more minutes for the lunch break. I would like to just get my head around what we heard before opening the floor. So we heard a really big range of perspective and topics. So we heard healthcare professionals and in various countries and organizations that speak about the fact that medicines used for treating common diseases, old medicines, are not in any way adapted to children because the way of using them, posology, doses, formulation are not right. So they need to be used somehow based on collective and cumulative experience. So this is one part of the big range of unmet needs in a way. Then we heard diseases for which the research for adults has made enormous progresses. There are many products being developed or even already on the market for cancer, various cancers, that do not have a sufficient correspondence for children. So we are facing a really large range that healthcare professionals need to deal with, because they deal with children presenting in the praxis, in the hospital, and they may be affected by all of these conditions. So obviously there is no one size fits all. We also heard that there are various methodological issues and approaches to unmet needs. How do we conduct studies? How do we ask the right questions? We just heard from Eurordis, the diseases may be rare, we may not have the right endpoints, we may not have the right instruments, tools to even capture what valuable information may be gleaned from these studies. So the unmet needs issue has many facets, and everybody needs to play a role in addressing them. And we have heard some of these points expressed very clearly. Not all of them can be addressed, and in fact, not very many of them can be addressed by the regulation and the legislation, but awareness of those from all the players is important, because nobody will be able to say, I didn't know about it. So I think this is a very important first point that we want to bring from this workshop, is listening to each other, what we were saying at the beginning, so that we don't go home and say, nobody ever told me that this particular test is actually not meaningful, or nobody ever told me that there are, 25 medicines authorized for adults and 0 for children. So this convening at the EMA now really wants to be an effort, a joint collective effort to share a perspective and share the responsibilities to address it. With this kind of setting the scene, I open the floor for questions. You can ask questions to the speakers, to the panelists, but also to other members of the audience. And I think it's important if the dialogue actually takes off in all possible directions, like a big star. So please. Yes, please, go ahead, Mark.
Hi, my name is Mark Turner.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for introducing yourself. Yeah. I mean, sorry. Yeah. All the speakers, all those that intervene, please introduce yourself and your affiliation so that we know who you are. And Mark already started by saying that, so sorry even for interrupting you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Mark Turner. With Akdae, I co-chair the European Network of Paediatric Research at the European Medicines Agency. If I may, I'd like to make one comment and suggest 2 action points for the concrete operational plan. The comment, having been involved in many priority setting exercises, I think it's important to draw a distinction between agenda setting and prioritization. For me, agenda setting is a multi-stakeholder process where you find out what's possible and what's needed, but that's different from prioritization, which has to involve the people that control the resources. Only people that control the resources can actually make decisions about prioritization, because you can't force people to spend money that they control. So we can't tell companies what to spend their money on. They have to spend it on what meets their commercial needs. Although we do have to bear in mind that patients and sites are also investing in drug development programs. So I think agenda setting and prioritization. And then 2 action points as just suggestions. First of all, 1 action point seemed to come from the discussions about data and data standards relating to the definition of paediatric needs. And I heard from Marie-Yvonne some suggestions about what a need would look like. But I also heard from other people about a lot of other initiatives that are looking at how data is structured. And things like Unmet and Tjitske and Medra are working in this space already. So I think it's worth proactively trying to take account of the needs and expressing them in ways that fit with regulatory requirements, such as being Medra compatible, and take the comprehensive approach that Marie-Yvonne suggested. So the action point I suggest is to build on Marie-Yvonne's framework for the definition of a need and include posology and everything else, and ensure that's consistent with other data definitions like Unmet and Tjitske and Medra, and do that within 6 months, and distinguish between nice to have data and data that's essential for medicine's development. And then the next part of that would be to test it with some conditions within 12 months, and then scale up within 24 months.
Wow.
That's an action point. Okay. So you want to discuss that? Because I've got another action point as well.
Go with the second action point. I'm sure people need time to think.
So the second action point relates to multi-stakeholder meetings, which I think can then build on shared definitions. And I think we can all work on the paediatric pulmonary artery hypertension as a case study over the next 6 months, and those discussions are going on already. Maybe we can find ways to do that for 3 or 4 other conditions within 12 months. But the real need here, I think, is to identify mechanisms for funding and hosting these. We've heard about 7,000 rare diseases, and there are plenty of common diseases as well. I'm sure the EMA may need some help in hosting 7,000 stakeholder meetings. Or we need to find other ways of working apart from things which have been so successful in the past, that exact copies of stakeholder or TACT in neuromuscular disorders or pediatric pulmonary artery hypertension, it may not be possible to copy those directly because there are so many needs. And so we need to find models for doing that. And so I suggest that we think about those models over the next 12 months and have a definition of how that's going to work within 12 months and then test it within 24 months. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Any immediate reaction to Mark's points and action points? I think he did. Yeah. Oh, Agnès, please.
Yeah, Agnès Saint-Raymond, EMA. Mark, can I challenge you a little bit on what you just said about this need to involve those controlling the resources first? Because I think needs and resources are completely independent of each other. I totally agree with you. It's out of question to hold 7,000 meetings on each and every single rare disease. But if we follow the resources, there would be no research in rare disease at all. And we know that if we look at resources, the cheapest way is to do nothing. So I think this is not the way forward. It will have to be factored in the decision to do certain things rather than others because funds are limited. But I think they should not start with money. They should start with the unmet need and the seriousness of the disease and what is killing children still today in the developed country and what is really out of scope of what we currently have as treatment. That's the first thing for me in terms of needs rather than the money.
Thank you for expressing it better than I could. I think we need to start with the needs in agenda setting, but then the prioritization needs to have some attention to the resources as well.
The gentleman there with the, yeah.
Paolo Rossi, I'm a pediatrician from Rome. I represented the Italian Network for Pediatric Clinical Trials, and I'm a former PDCO member. My reaction to the presentation and to this discussion is that we have to, that has been catched by Dr. Alteri also, is that we have to distinguish very well the condition that where we have all medicines and still we have problems with that, with the new medicine. With the old medicine, the approach that we have been listened from the Dutch group, it's a very interesting one. We have done a similar exercise in Italy, where we have analyzed the use of old medicine, and we have approached that with evidence-based medicine in order to give to the doctors the ability to use those medicine in a more safe way. So I think this type of approach is completely different from the new medicine. So we have to distinguish these two fields. For the new fields, I agree with, in a way, I agreed with Mark that the resources are important, because if we don't have money to develop the medicine, we will not develop them. But in the same time, I also agree with Agnès that we need to have a distinct way of thinking. We cannot start from money. We have to start from the science that has to drive the money into science. And the example is not only the rare disease, but also some specific diseases, innovative approaches. So I think this two way of thinking has to be distinguished, because then we can work on the first part very, very quickly and work on the second in a more structured way.
Thank you. The gentleman in the back there, and then I have the W.
Thank you. Ramanan, I'm an academic pediatrician from UK. Just to make two comments, really. The pediatric regulation has done a huge favor for pediatrics across Europe. But there is a feast and famine situation. There are some diseases, because they have adult equivalents, there's been a flurry of PIPs and studies. And in those conditions, the major need for the next decade is not having multiple placebo-controlled trials, but head-to-head studies, which somehow the PDCOs need to engage with industry and persuade them to do so. And then there is the issue of rare diseases which don't have adult equivalent. How do you incentivize or get industry to study in these areas which might be of limited commercial interest?
So, please, Martina from W.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Martina Penazzato. I'm the pediatric HIV lead in WHO Geneva. And as part of that, I'm working with other colleagues in WHO to really accelerate some of the work that is undergoing to enable better access to medicine for children, really following the WHO resolution that happened in 2016, which has really revamped some of the more collaborative work that we're all doing in WHO. In that context, I think that the priority setting and assessment of pediatric needs is really something that we see as something that we really need to take responsibility for, at least with the global lens. And that obviously entails looking at the burden of disease, as has been mentioned earlier, but also which obviously lead to target the biggest killers globally, particularly in low and middle income countries, but also considering those rare diseases which require a safety net in a way to develop the drugs that are needed to treat those conditions. Now, within WHO, we've done a number of exercises to assess those needs and also to prioritize them, particularly focusing on the essential medicine list process. But we've also conducted some priority setting exercises within specific disease and technical areas. And I'm just going to build on the HIV experience, which is the one that I know the most. And I think that we were pretty successful there in trying to really bring a lot of stakeholders around the table and develop a list of priority products that needs to be developed in the next years. With that in mind, we really see this as something that is an ongoing process that we are also considering to expand to other disease areas. TB and hepatitis are the first examples. And if those are proven to be effective and successful, we're really open and keen to consider other disease areas as well with the same approach. I think that to follow up some of the points that were made, the lessons that we've learned from the HIV experience is that unfortunately, the market logic and the business logic when it comes to pediatric products can't really be applied. And that requires being innovative and think about alternative mechanisms to fund some of these development plan. So I do think that we need to disconnect the assessment of needs and the priority setting with the resources. Even though I do agree that considering the perspective of industry and really engaging in a very transparent and open dialogue with regards to how to best focus resources. So it's not just necessarily about creating new resources, but also target those in a more focused way and really optimize the resources that are already available towards the product that have the highest impact at the global level.
Thank you. Professor Vassal.
Just a short word on prioritization, as mentioned by Mark. When we started the concept of a pediatric strategy forum, we named them prioritization forum. And at that time, we understood that it was not possible at all, because no one would come to a place where prioritization should be done. So I agree, defining the need and the strategy is just setting the landscape for prioritization, which is very much what are the drugs, where are the resources. And I think this is very important. But sharing the same level of information from everyone for the further discussion is very much the concept of the strategy forum that we are proposing. The second point is we should prevent ourselves to try in the next 2 years to identify all pediatric needs in all diseases, because we will not address all these needs. And this is why my proposal would be that the disease groups really worked, and this is really an initiative that all the disease groups should check in terms of defining in their disease what are the questions, which are very much different from a disease to another one. The old drugs, the new ones, too many or not enough. And from an EMA perspective, it would be coming from the summary and the report of the last 10 years, and defining where clearly there are extremely urgent questions to address. Because all the diseases I mentioned by the colleagues from the UK, where there are too many drugs for the patients, there will still be many more drugs developed in adults. And then the question will still be very important in the future. So clearly, if we identify the scope of the different questions, maybe we will better find the tools, because my proposal is that there is not one tool that will cover all the diseases and all the needs.
Yeah, Heidrun Hildebrand from Bayer, and I would like to make one comment to this. I would a little bit also caution to set resources always equivalent to money. Resources is also know-how in a specific disease area, and really the capability to really set up development programs. And while for big industry, you can always argue, yes, you should find the money to find the expertise. We have a lot of small and medium-sized companies who only have one product and are very, very focused on a very specific area. And based on the regulations, they need a pediatric development plan. But I think for them, it might become very, very hard to go into a completely different area where they don't have their expertise. And I even don't think it would be helpful for the patient if that would go that way. So I think we have to somehow separate the must and the ask in the regulation from the medical need areas where you maybe don't even have an adult program or an adult drug to work with.
Look.
Sorry, if I just to a small specification. I think that when we are speaking about stakeholder, we are quite traditional. We are thinking as stakeholder as companies, and I think that in many ways we need to expand this concept, especially for the rare disease, also to charities and different kind of foundation, because I totally agree that for rare disease it's going to be quite difficult to find companies that are willing to finance this kind of trial, but it's going to be easier to find foundation or companies that are willing to do so. And so I think that we need to set up a good process that will be able to involve them. For instance, in our stakeholder forum, the forum that I was mentioning in my presentation, we will have representative from at least 3 charities that have already mentioned that are willing to participate. And and this is intriguing also because, ERNs are based on an European law, and we have to deal with the European boundary. But in a way, to set up this kind of stakeholder forum, and we will be happy to involve also regulators in this, and eventually to have the forum here at EMA, it would be really important to be inclusive of other players that are not so common right now.
Other hands. Oh, down there. Okay.
Hi, Giovanni Migliaccio from EATRIS, the Translational Medicine Infrastructure. I will do two statements here. One is that we all agree that we will need a new paradigm for developing drug in the next future to deal with small population, non-economical drug development, and so on. Rare disease and personalized medicine are coming, and we will need to deal with that. The next sentence, it's a different one. Right now, our paradigm is mostly to use adult medicine and to translate their use into children. And that is using what we have at the best. And my suggestion will be, as a priority, to use what we have at the best. And at the moment, there is a lot of research that is, let's say, not efficiently used for translational purpose. And this applies to everything. So most of the academic funds are not really geared to give us translational data. And this is both for adult and pediatrics. So one action should be how to, let's say, favor the use of what we have as funding for research to have drugs for pediatrics. And one point will be just to have more data on what is normal human development. We still don't have a lot of data there.
Thank you. Other interventions, questions? Actually, it would be interesting if colleagues from industry would react to some of the statements made by colleagues here. Would you like to? Don't be shy. Geneviève.
Geneviève Levisage, Novartis, representing EFPIA. I think clearly for industry, the key thing is being able to frame the discussion in something that is predictable and where we can have a project we can run and understand how we run it. So at the end of it, having a definition of the unmet need just help us direct our companies. We are in a company dealing with a lot of different projects, and each one must have a reason and a predictable path. And I think that's what a dictionary, a registry, a list of medical needs, an unmet one can help us. It allows us to have discussion with our research companies that can actually direct the research in the right place. Instead of us, as Marie-Yvonne was explaining, discussing individually with key opinion leaders or network what could be done. It also allows those discussions to be much more structured as well. It also allows companies to stop doing the same thing without knowing that they are doing the same thing. Because if you have something you can pick up from, you can understand who are the actors, who are the researchers, then that dialogue is much easier. So, we don't have to react. I think for us, we are much more user than a maker. We just are ready to come and say, well, tell us where we should use and direct the resources. And it is a fact. In an industry, you are competing. You have to really get your clinical team to understand what they can research. So having those needs defined and the research out there helps us.
Please.
Hi, I'm Rob Camp from Eurordis. I just wanted to mention that unmet medical needs and patient-relevant outcomes can't be defined without the patient voice. I think that patients need to be the center of those definitions. And fine, we can't have 7,000 focus groups for each disease necessarily, but we need to somehow get our heads around the fact that one of the reasons why it hasn't been done up until now is because it's complicated and we haven't included the patient, and we have to do that in the future.
Good point, thank you. Do I see any other hands? Down there? Nope. Everyone agrees, but on what?
To what?
Shall we do another quick round from the panel? What do you think of these questions? Oh, down there, please.
Thank you, it was very quiet. My name is Dimitrios Athanasiou. I'm a PDCO member representing Eurordis and also in the World Duchenne organization. I would like to be a little provocative because we were very quiet. I think that efficacy is a very key factor, for example, in drug development and covering the unmet needs. Obviously, we cannot have in SMA or DMD or whatever trials 10 or 15 placebo arms. As mentioned from the industry, yes, the small biotechs cannot support, let's say, if they have one product, but you should expect that you cooperate in a preclinical level with somebody else, because you cannot have 10 placebo arms and then try to make efficacy and money out of it. Obviously, we have to be more effective in the drug development, but also from the regulatory point of view, I think we have to be also innovative in the designs that we accept in the products. And my last comment is the fragmentation of data, because we've heard a lot about data. So we're collecting everything irrelevant to each other. And I think there is a very big area where we can work together in centrally collecting data, even the European level, even disease level, because the disease registries are important and not the drug registries. Thank you.
Down there, one more intervention.
Good morning, Victoria Headley from Newcastle University. I just want to back up what a few of the colleagues have been saying around data, actually. We have obviously quite strong overlap and relevance between the paediatric field and the rare disease field. And as several colleagues have explained, I think over the last few years for sure, in the rare disease community, we've really focused on how we can increase the utility and the reusability of the precious data that we have. Because as Giovanni explained, if you're going to get interest in developing therapies for rare conditions, for pediatric conditions, you have to have some sort of incitation, you have to have data there. If you don't know what the natural development is, you can't do anything. And for the really rare conditions, you actually have to take every kind of data, every piece of data that you can. There's been a lot of emphasis on coding rare diseases with the author code, as Mark explained earlier, and we've looked a lot in the rare disease field at the European level at registries and how we can better share registry data. I think CRF data, trial data, is kind of a slightly untapped area for us, and this is something that we are trying to address and to solve a bit in the new IMI2 initiative, Connect for Children. So my colleagues at Newcastle are leading a piece of work there where we're trying to do exactly what Mark mentioned earlier, which is to try to get some sort of harmonization for pediatric terminology specifically, because we all, when we're collecting data on trials for pediatric participants, we record things, crucial things, simple things in very, very many different ways. So getting some sort of harmonization there is very important. But we also really want in that task to do exactly this, to bring together these different fruits and these different experiences. So, bringing coding into CRF data. But I think what's really important to do that, and what's sort of missing for me at the minute, is real clarity on how much people are willing to share. And CRF data is obviously a little different to registry data, but natural history data in CRFs collected in trials for children, that's really important. Placebo arm data is really, really valuable natural history data that we are not using as much at the moment as we can. So we encourage everyone to work with us as we move through this piece of work to try to address that, because for sure, I think our best prospects are to link up as many different types of data as you can. You'll never link everything, it's not possible, but we can apply more cutting edge, big data management and interoperability tools to make better use of what's already there.
Thank you. Very good points. Please.
So my name is Anne-Marie Jansson-Dang from Sweden, from the Medical Products Agency. So I think a few of the last speakers here have clarified that there is a need for registers, and there has also been discussions on trials. So I think we need to be clear, when do we use what? Because of course there is a very clear rationale for doing research on what is actually used at the clinics, what is happening, so to say. But when it comes to decide on what will happen to the patient by a protocol that is an interventional safety and efficacy clinical trial, we really need to do it within the framework of a clinical trial. So I think it is very clear here, so there is no understanding that perhaps if registers are just expanded, they can even replace clinical trials. If you look at the robustness of the data, if you look at the safety, integrity and rights of the subjects, those are extremely well defined in the clinical trial setting, but less so in other settings. So I think it would be good actually also to clarify these two different ways of analyzing data. And let me also remind you that there are quite a lot of non-commercial clinical trials where the sponsor is using a registered drug for a new indication, perhaps pediatric indication, in order to find data that could support future involvement in pediatric use. So I think we have lots of stakeholders here, and I think there is a need to clarify these different aspects so we suddenly don't think that everything can be done in registries, because I think the robustness of the data and the rights of the subjects will not be as well guarded.
Thank you for your intervention. Any other question? Please, Mark, again.
Can I just support, though, what my colleague was saying. Ultimately, if you want to have a medicine for children, you need to pass approval. And running a PIP is not, it's part of it. At the end of it, your data must be strong enough to bear the scrutiny of the registration process to show quality, safety and efficacy. And I 100% agree with you. We need to really be very clear about what can we do with the data we have, and can it actually be sufficient for registration. And clinical trials are still the way we do work. So we need to really think about that one.
Mark.
So I wonder if I could suggest a third action point, building on what Anne-Marie and Victoria have said, which was to define strategies for sharing data. Clearly, in the ideal world, as we define the need, we're defining it using the same data that will then form the natural history, that will then inform drug development and post-marketing surveillance or prescribing. So I wonder whether it's worth finding a way to bring those things together, to take account of natural history and registration purposes and post-marketing clinical use in a way that takes account of the different sources of data, paying attention to the IP issues that will arise, paying attention to interoperability, both technical and semantic, and the scope and the purpose of what the data can be used for. So I think that's slightly bigger than the methodology for identifying pediatric medical needs, but in the ideal world, the data that is used to define needs then feeds into subsequent work, so that we're starting with the goal in mind, that we're designing the needs with the quality that we need. So that's a third action point. Again, slightly more controversial than the first two. I'll stop.
Yes, and Heidrun again. I have one point adding to what also Genevieve was saying, going even a step further. And as Thomas is not in the room here from Unmet HTAs, I think the next hurdle is then bringing the approved product to the patient. And as long as we don't have the HTAs and the payers in the loop, and they agree that a small study with 20, 30 children based on extrapolation is sufficient to grant at least reimbursement. I'm not even talking on any certain price, I'm just talking the reimbursement hurdle. We will not manage to get that product into the formularies of the hospitals and in the prescription list of the general practitioners. And I think so for me, the other plea is please widen this and include the payer representatives in all this kind of discussions. Otherwise, we stuck after we have done all the work.
Can I suggest a fourth action point?
Suggest, please, go right ahead. I think we have already more than 4, anyway.
Oh, no, I was following Mark, you know.
Okay.
I always follow Mark.
Always.
1, 2, 3, number 4. To look at the report and identify where clearly there is a need in several diseases, because there are too much PIPs not delivering at the moment, and it's not only because patients are not recruiting in the trial. And in the next 2 years, 2 years and a half, well, 3 years, have 10 of these diseases, and all stakeholders in the room, including the patient's advocate, and figuring out where we are. Cleaning the landscape of things that will never deliver, identify with the academia and the parents how we will improve, based on science and needs, the development further. And I see several. Diabetes type 2, multiple sclerosis, the field of psychiatry, and of course several pediatric malignancies. So then we will improve the success of the pediatric medicine regulation, where at the moment it's not clear that things can be really successful, and define better in the next 2 years how in this area improve the landscape, whereas still drugs are developed by companies in adults and should address the needs of patients, but not all children.
Dirk, please. I hear you want to comment.
Thank you. I'm not adding another action point. I'm Dirk Mentzer, current chair of the PDCO. You will hear me later on again. But I would just like to come back to the approach of the HTAs you mentioned from the industry. Fully agreement with that. And exactly that's the point where we can't persuade, we have little access to HTAs from PDCO. This is very far away. It's probably the most furthest away area we can reach out, although we have done so. Anyway, what we try instead is actually what we are discussing with you here at the moment. I believe to the people who are sitting in those HTA organizations, if we have a drug development in a pediatric unmet need, the additional benefit is there per se, because if, as we are trying to define now, as you heard, if there's nothing available, if there's a high disease burden, if there's so and so, what you have already said. So that's why we are trying to come from our way to actually go and define those needs in a way that the HTAs could follow in adding this additional benefit to the reimbursement, for example. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. So again, I'm very pleased already with what we've been heard, and let's try to find an approach to get a shared view or shared agreement, like Mark said, and not only on financial, but also on science here. Thanks.
Thank you, Dirk. Any further questions? Please.
Yeah. I mean, just to reiterate, I mean, as we've heard, it's a very large and challenging area, and I fully support the concept of us identifying a certain number of areas to develop a proof of concept, and then that can be spread out later on. And we've heard very clear, beautiful examples this morning of where things have been successful, from pulmonary hypertension, the pediatric strategy forums in oncology, and there's a sense of urgency to move forward. We shouldn't try and invent the wheels. We should use those mechanisms and try and advance them further.
Thank you. Please.
My name is Seno Simmons, representing the European Society for Pediatric Research, and I would like to ask a few minutes attention for the field of neonatology, because that's not been discussed that much this morning. And I think we use the highest rates of off-label and unlicensed drugs in our units. and all these preterm infants that are in need of protection of their brain and lungs. And I think that's not only about money that we need from the industry, but we also need their knowledge on drug development and how to develop better dosages and new drugs for our patients. So I think I would really address that point of action there, that it's not only about sharing money, but also about sharing knowledge. And if you look at what doctors use in departments nowadays, I think there's a lack of knowledge about drug use that's tremendous. And so I think that's my point there. Thank you.
Thank you. Down there, please.
Yeah. Hello, Mariska Mulder from Sanofi. I would like to reiterate what Mr. Vassal just said, that we are really focusing here on what the pediatric medical needs are, but we should also focus on where the needs are, where we don't have any needs, like for instance with diabetes type 2 or MS, as already mentioned, because we as industry can then focus our resources on the right medical needs and treat those.
Thank you. Do I see any other hands? No. If not, what I would like to do is to have, now that we heard a lot of different voices and the member of the panel have heard each other, can I ask each one of you to reflect in what is the most important take for you from any other stakeholders that have intervened? What do you walk away with? And I think just to close the circle of reflection, it would be an interesting exercise. We start with the same order as we began.
The take-home message is, and this is something that we are already working on, are the relevance of the natural history studies and how to produce a good standard for a natural history study that could be shared among all the ERNs and also among all the people that are willing to work on the pediatric field. And as a second topic connected to that, how are we calling the thing with the same name? Meaning that we need also standardization on the terminology and the way in which we are not only collecting the data, as Vicky was saying before, but also aggregating the data, merging the different kind of data, and the methodology in which we are running the study. Because in the scoping exercise that we have performed last year, we have seen that there is a big disparity in the way in which things are named, and then it's really difficult to find a good merging of the data.
Tjitske.
Yeah, I think my most important take-home message at this point is that we should really better use all the data that are already existing. There's a lot of focus on generating new data and new studies and new trials, but there's so much out there that we don't use properly. Data that are generated in hospitals, in just the clinical daily practice use that are documented, and they're not documented very structurally and systematically. But we should really make better use of those data without doing extra harm to children in exposing them to studies. So I think that's an interesting finding.
Please, Martina.
Yes, I want to make 3 points. What I take home first, I think it's very important, beside building registries, which I would underline, that it's very important to fund research, basic research on the human development, even in the light of mental and behavioral disorders, because there we have still no data. Some colleague behind mentioned it. The second is to prioritize or first identify unmet medical needs. I will think it's very important to focus also on existent, even authorized medications and their side effects or long-term outcomes, or even not known long-term outcomes, which may pose some risks on the patients. And the last point, I would add a comment when it comes to HTA. I can follow the point that in areas where we have no much or no treatments, that a medication in pediatric field is per se a good thing. But I think we should also have a balance between thoroughly health technology assessment, even to avoid a side effect or long-term outcomes which are unwanted and maybe not seen at the time of authorization. Thank you.
Thank you. Gilles.
Sure. I'm very pleased because it seems that everyone in the room agrees that we should move from a drug-centric approach, which was for the last 10 years what was the pediatric medicine regulation, to a patient-centric approach, a science-driven approach, which I think will be a way really to improve the development of new drugs. And I do not ignore the issue of better use of the old drugs, which are really two different topics that we should address differently, but address at the same time. And I think the second message for me is that for the next years, there is a real role for the disease group, the ERNs, the academic people, really considering this is an opportunity really to improve the treatment they are using, along with the patients and the parents, which I think is something that will change the landscape over the next 10 years as compared to what happened over the last 10 years. And finally, for the HTA, it's exactly the same for us. We don't have access to them yet, and we will really love to do.
Marie-Yvonne.
Yes, I heard really a common effort to better identify the pediatric medical needs. I think that a definition and a standardization of a terminology will help us, and an easier access to data, as well as status on clinical research and ongoing trials.
Thank you. So we move on to Anne, please.
Yes. Thousand malignancies is really too much for 2 years. So I really would focus on the malignancies that we know, for which the PMR was not efficient, and that our groups are ready to go to concrete actions. I also believe that there is a big need of a strong voice for patients and carers. And last but not least, there's really a big urgency. I know that we all know that somehow there's kind of a phase till the next commission, or at least the next commission that will be active, that will be in the end of 2019. Till there's still a long road to go, and a lot could be done. So I hope it will be done. At least we are ready for it.
Hal.
Well, coming from the patient side, I'm very happy to hear about the patient-centric approach. And another thing I guess I bring home is that when I hear the discussions here, I hear that there's a lot of good initiatives going on, and I have great hopes for the future.
And Virginie?
Thank you. I probably have 3 points as well. The first one, what was obvious, is the importance of data collection, and also data collection all along the life cycle of a product in order to get the benefits from what is gather in the clinical development, but also in the real-world setting, and that will help also the decision in HTA. I think one thing that will be helpful, and I would like to reinforce the message, that we really need to have more collaboration between the industry and the existing networks, meaning pediatric networks or ERNs. So this is something that is really timely to discuss, I assume. And also bearing in mind that pediatrics and orphan are not two different fields most of the case. I mean, often they are the same patient that we are speaking about. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as well. And the last point on the patient centricity. So I also hear this shift, and this is very welcome. And I really think that, in fact, now we can consider maybe the product more as a service to the patient than as a product itself. So that's my take-home message.
Thank you so much. And I give the floor to Dirk to summarize, which means that we will probably be able to have a small break. But please, Dirk, go ahead.
Thanks, Enrica. And I'm not sure whether you can see me better now from this row. And hopefully you can apologize my voice, which caught a bit of an interruption last week. So thanks to all of you, and thanks to EMA and European Commission to host this stakeholder meeting. I'm very pleased so far, as I said, to what I've heard. And of course, thanks to the panel to share all the information they had on their view and approaches so far. Also thanks to Rocchio and Chrissy, who helped me with a few lines here, so you can follow my next few minutes when I try to summarize what I have, and together with Chrissy, heard from you from this morning. And before starting again, thanks that we have already got some action points here for going forward. I will come to that later. So in my view, I have divided the morning into 4 areas. One on the disease burden, one on the property of medicinal product. Apology to Gilles that the drugs are not really out of the scope here. The availability of clinical and scientific information and knowledge. And finally, the national and international cooperation and organizations are available, or so forth. So if I would like to elucidate more on each section, on the first, I think it was very impressive to hear that, of course, the seriousness and the life-threatening property of the disease is very important, whether it causes comorbidities and has a likelihood to cause disability seems to be a huge impact on defining the pediatric needs. The developmental impact also, on top of that, seems to have a huge aspect to define those needs. And of course, finally, the area of whether the disease is neglected with regards to treatment should also take considerations. And here I find it quite interesting to look whether the rarity of disease in pediatrics may have a different view, for example, for the orphans definition, because it may be an orphan's disease in pediatrics but not in adults. So from that point, as it looks into the disease as such as a rarity, it may not suffice for an orphan's medicine as it's only for pediatrics. So maybe that should be something to look whether the prevalence view on the orphan's definition should also have an impact on whether it's rare for pediatrics only. Sorry. So that was on the disease burden. I think that is the top driver to steer us to the defining of the pediatric medical need. The second, of course, we can't ignore the property of the medicinal product, and here whether it is potentially, of course, because at the time we look from the PDCO, it may be only potential, but if it looks like it's a life-saving drug or a drug for modifying diseases, that would be very important for us to look into. And also, if the drug has a number of alternatives, we heard that type 2 diabetes, for example, and multiple sclerosis from Gilles, of course, that that should be also considered here, whether this is one in a way or whether there's many others. And we also have to look into this area, of course, when we try to find the pediatric needs. This also means that, on the other hand, if there's few or little available for pediatrics, but maybe also some or more available for adults, we're calling this nowadays off-label use, I think we should have a look into the potential whether this has an impact on the pediatric needs definition for us as such. And of course, I find it very interesting to hear the approach on collecting data aside of the normal CRF information on, for example, national history. That also comes later to the third point. I think this is a very interesting area where we may have to look into how to facilitate this. So that leads me to the point of the available scientific knowledge in this area of pediatric needs. And here I think the very utmost important knowledge for me to know is, when we discuss PEPs, is where's the need for treatment. So is this a treatment where we have many other available opportunities, or whether this is just new and nice and fashionable, and whether we should sort of just put the same effort in this as we do for other medicinal developments. And of course, this is based on the clinical and science information we have. So meaning searching the network, searching the research areas, how much available information do we have, how much do we need for the pediatric population when it comes to the clinical trial and the development of this drug. In addition, and this was very important I also learned from the PAH workshop, for example, we mentioned that endpoints, for example, may suffice for adults and looks nice for extrapolation, but eventually this is not possible for pediatrics because we can't use this kind of endpoint in adults. Although the mode of action may support extrapolation, it may not be supported because the endpoint in pediatrics needs to be different, and we have no correlation here. So if that is the point, I think we have to look into more science here and more clinical experience, how we can merge those informations. The neglected research area, yes, it spreads out, I think, among all pediatric disease. There are many neglected areas per se, not only by population. We know the neonatal problem. I think here the question for me would be how much funding should go into this research areas and who is providing this funding. Interesting article in a German science newspaper said that there should be a non-commercial funding paid by all responsibility stakeholders, insurance companies, governments and industry. So that's interesting, and maybe is country specific. One also important information I think I got from the first speaker this morning was the available of quality of life tools, how to assess the patient relevant outcomes. I think this is something really we have to look into, how much available information we have here to also define natural history of the disease. So see what can we improve in this field. Finally, the national and international cooperative organization. Bear with me, Gilles, I didn't call it strategy forum, but I think the example you made with the oncology strategy forum, it's excellent, and this should actually be a promotion to repeat this in other areas like we have defined here, maybe on not only on oncology as such on a treatment group, but also on maybe overarching areas. We had the PAH forum stakeholder meeting, last year, which was very, very interesting and very successful, as we had also a cooperative joint FDA Health Canada, apart from industry and patient, of course. So I think here this is sort of some cooperation between the stakeholders on strategy, how to approach problems where we're facing in pediatric drug development. Interesting to hear from industry to the view that asking key opinion leaders in the area of academia, maybe also on other representatives in science. This is, of course, very important for the definition as those key opinion leaders may be in the place who see the needs for treatment. But I think we should broaden this into a multi-stakeholder approach, like, for example, the Pediatric Strategy Forum. The disease registers, I think that's a high topic also in this agency currently, how to develop and how to promote those information collection. Personally, I'm a bit reluctant to look into this. If it's just a voluntary data sampling, it may not be helpful for regulators, it may be helpful for others. So we have to find a common core data set here where we can agree this should be the minimal criteria, so everyone has a use of it, not only maybe the academia who has a different view on those data, but also the regulators and industry, so we can use those data as said to promote or even to elucidate more knowledge in the pediatric drug development. The early dialogue, I think is important, and that would be something we have to look into here at the EMA, how we can promote some sort of early dialogue information with the stakeholders, not only industry, but also with pediatrics, parents, and academia, to have some sort of view and repeated information on where is the most neglected area, or where's the most used area and most information available. So that could be also in the other way around. Public and health care professional education on clinical trial purposes, it's very important, but maybe that I have to deliver to the colleagues in the field who are actually doing the education. I know the EMA has had an impact with the GRIP program. This is, I think, a good start, but it needs to be spread out in each country in the same way, not only by a central organization, to find more hearing in there. Finally, the reach out to other stakeholders. The IMI projects, we have now the third or the second or the third round, I can't remember. This is important, where the academia, the industry and the regulators are coming together to develop more tools and information on in this case then the pediatric drug development with the research centers. So this is important to promote, of course. Maybe very little to do for us at that time, but I think there we can work on supporting as much as we can. And finally, the reach out to the HTAs. It's clearly that's a neglected area for PDCO for a long time. We have never thought about this problem, but I think there we need to try to open the doors to speak to them in future to make sure that the drugs we are defining here with the applicants are actually eventually going to the bedside whenever they are ready. So that's my summary for this morning. Some general issues, but I also think we got a number of specific aspects we can work with. And of course, we will build our action plan in the forthcoming. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dirk. And so we have heard a lot of what to do. We have also heard, to a large extent, who will do that. And of course, various stakeholders will have different roles in the various actions and ideas, suggestions that came out. We also heard a little bit about how we can do it, and particularly thank you to Mark, who has proposed a number of quite specific actions. And so thank you for all the participants and the discussion.